Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically about the chapter on everyone's minds, the upcoming licensed collaboration with Resident Evil. For those who aren't aware, I made a longer video about the possibility of Resident Evil coming to Dead by Daylight and discussing the implementation of it about 5 weeks ago. I made it roughly 5 days before the Resident Evil anniversary livestream brought with it an announcement for a Resident Evil chapter that was actually coming to Dead by Daylight. See, clearly what happened here is I made the video, Behaviour obviously watched it and went, "Oh fuck, the lore guy's here talking about Resident Evil, we best get the chapter out quick," and immediately announced it so as to appease me. See, my giant wizard lore brain is clearly so big and powerful that I made this chapter happen just by thinking it. Just like I made the Decisive Strike nerf happen, and Colorblind mode, and Plague's new lore being amazing. Clearly, I'm just a fucking genius. I'm just too smart. But apparently, not even a mega brain super genius like me is completely infallible. For some reason, a few people seem to be convinced that I'm wrong? Weird, I know, me? Wrong? Doesn't sound in character. But let's humour them for a second. Maybe with the chapter reveal coming up in less than a week, it might be time to reevaluate the option Resident Evil presents to us, both from the survivor and killer perspective. So that's what this video aims to achieve. My last Resident Evil video talked about what I think should be in a Resident Evil chapter, but this one is looking more what I think we're likely to actually get. So let's get started by talking about the survivors. Everyone seems to be convinced that this upcoming chapter is going to be a 2-survivor deal like Stranger Things. And while I think that's certainly a possibility, and I think I would prefer it that way, it is by no means a guaranteed option. Stranger Things is still our only 2-survivor chapter, and we've received no concrete indication that we're getting multiple RE survivors. That being said, this doesn't really change the options all that much. The big 4 candidates are Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy, Jill Valentine, and Claire Redfield. And I'll be real, it's not very clear which one or two we're actually going to get. At this point, all 4 of them have some sort of reason to make it in. Leon is the fan favourite, and his army of fanboys and fangirls will probably threaten to storm Behaviour's offices if their favourite twink doesn't make it in. While Jill is the natural opposition to Nemesis, who is, spoiler alert, the most likely killer candidate. Chris ties the older games in with the newer ones, since he's the only member of the main RE cast to come back for Resident Evil 7 and 8, and a comment by M. Cote during the Resident Evil stream, "Kill or be killed," suggests we might be getting Claire. But that could just as easily be a red herring, or advertising for a Claire skin for another character, as it could be for Claire herself being our survivor. We could just be getting one RE survivor, or a man and a woman together in any combination. And frankly, we just don't know for sure. Partially, I think it'll depend on the killer. If the killer is from an older game, they might want to include Chris as a character who ties in with the newer games as well as the originals. Or if the killer is Nemesis, then Jill is almost certainly coming with him. Speaking of the killer, let's try and answer the question on everyone's minds. Who's gonna be the big baddie of Resident Evil that makes it into the chapter? The way I see it, the biggest 5 candidates to look out for are the following: Nemesis from Resident Evil 3, Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7, Lady Alcina Dimitrescu or one of her daughters from Resident Evil 8, and William Birkin from Resident Evil 2. They're by all means not the only candidates. I know Heisenberg from RE8 and Albert Wesker from RE1 to 5 have been advocated by a lot of players. But Heisenberg, being a very spoiler-heavy character, for a game that's only been out a few weeks, counts about the running, I think. And between you and me, Capcom probably wants the world to forget about Wesker for the most part. Thank God for that. But which of these 5 are we likely to actually get? Let's start by taking the obvious one off of the list now: Mr. X. No, I'm not joking, I truly think Mr. X is the least likely candidate of all of these 5 characters to make it into DBD. If it is him, I'll eat my words for sure, but I think there's a single, very obvious obstacle that's in the way of Mr. X taking Ari's spot in DBD's killer lineup. And that obstacle is called Nemesis. Mr. X and Nemesis are both Tyrant series bioweapons, with Mr. X being the older variant of the Tyrant formula that was refined with a parasite to create Nemesis. The two are very similar. Both are large, strong, durable, emotionless, and completely fixated on the one goal that's programmed into them. But in every metric that makes them different, Nemesis is just so much more appealing as a killer than Mr. X. Nemesis is armed with a variety of weapons and has a tentacle mutation that functions as an extra appendage. What does X have to compete with that? Nothing. He just walks and punches, adjusting his hat occasionally. That's really all he's got. Nemesis is also probably a more iconic villain with a higher potential profit margin for behaviour and Capcom, with Mr. X's cult following only really springing up after the Resident Evil 2 remake. Nemesis is a face that has been associated with Resident Evil for decades, while they only did Mr. X justice on the second go round. If Nemesis was out of the picture, then Mr. X would likely be the second choice candidate. But I just can't imagine a world where behaviour figures out how to make a tyrant work in DBD and makes a power for Mr. X, without realising halfway through, oh wait, we could just give this power to Nemesis and make 3 times as much money. If behaviour is going to make a tyrant, they're going to make Nemesis, I can virtually guarantee it. And if they're not going to make a tyrant, they're obviously not making Mr. X anyway. That alone is the primary reason I'm very doubtful we're seeing Mr. X in Dead by Daylight. Something I'm not exactly heartbroken about. I find Mr. X to be uniquely boring as a character, like a much shittier Terminator, and he'd be the only candidate on this list I'd be actively disappointed to see in the game. So I'm pretty happy he is overshadowed so completely by his younger brother that his arrival is basically impossible. And by excluding Mr. X, it pains me to say that we're also probably going to have to exclude Birkin. Just as Mr. X is overshadowed by Nemesis by just being a better tyrant than him, Birkin is overshadowed in turn by Mr. X, by having to play second fiddle to X in the only game he's in. Don't get me wrong, I love William Birkin. He is by far my favourite part of Resident Evil 2. And I think with some minor alterations to make him, fit through doors, he'd be a fine killer. I just can't see a world where they'd pick the second best villain from RE2 when there are so many good options of best villains from other games in the series to pick from. Not totally ruling him out here, but I think seeing everyone's favourite mutant science dad in DBD is very unlikely indeed. Speaking of unlikely arrivals, I think we can rule out the Dimitrescu family here. There's no denying that Alcina, Bella, Cassandra and Daniela have taken the internet by storm over the past year and formed the backbone of basically all the marketing for Resident Evil Village. I'll say this now. If the chapter was coming out a year from now, when RE8 had time to settle in the public consciousness and test to see if it was well remembered, Lady D might have been the killer. Because if her popularity maintains at its current level going forward, she's liable to blow Nemesis out of the water with how rampantly she's loved. But as it stands, I think RE Village is just too new. The chapter was probably being put together during the very late stages of RE8's development time. That sounds like a logistical nightmare to arrange for a risk that neither Behaviour nor Capcom would necessarily want to even take. Not to mention the recent Observer lore for Tome 7 suggests that we're getting an original vampire killer for this year's Halloween release in Chapter 21. Call me crazy, but I don't think Behaviour would dedicate an Observer tome to advertising original vampire killer if a licensed vampire killer was next up in the pipeline. Sorry Lady D, I still love you, but I think you'll be sitting this one out. That leaves Nemesis and Jack. I think it goes without saying at this point that Nemesis is the standout option here. Much as I personally find him a little on the bland side, there's no denying just how beloved Nemesis is by RE's player base, and he's been the choice Capcom has wheeled out for crossovers before, most notably in Marvel vs. Capcom. Of all the killer options in Resident Evil, Nemesis I believe is easily the most likely, and I wouldn't even hate that. You can't blame Behaviour to picking up such an obvious cash cow, even if I do think he's kinda boring. But that's not to say that Nemesis is necessarily guaranteed. Marvel vs. Capcom is a fighting game, one to which Nemesis and his skill set is extremely well suited. But DBD is not. It's an asexual game where killers have to follow some sort of formula. They get stunned by pallets. The primary way of harming survivors is by closing the gap with melee attacks. They get stymied by map terrain and flashlights because that's how the game is designed. These are conditions that Nemesis does not fulfill, at least not without substantially changing him. In RE3, Nemesis almost always fights with ranged weaponry. He mostly uses a flamethrower or rocket launcher to try to kill Jill, and his tentacle is used more for grabbing or pulling stuff than it is as a weapon. Until he mutates into forms far too big for DBD, he mostly fights at long range with heavy firepower, which is something that Behaviour has never really been about. The closest we've ever come to that is a harpoon gun, hunting hatchets or throwing knives. Nemesis coming to 1v1 you at Cowtown with a flamethrower or rocket launcher doesn't really fit the game if you ask me. Not only that, he's meant to be big and unstoppable. A wooden pallet being able to stun him, or if blinding him with a flashlight would kind of break the feeling of being Nemesis a bit. Truth be told, it would make him feel cheap. The biggest obstacle to Nemesis in this game is implementation problems, without a doubt. Trying to scale down the threat level of a tyrant into DBD while maintaining their identity as a big relentless monster is a serious challenge. Especially if the goal on top of that is to create a unique, interesting and balanced power to suit them. That's a really tall order that behaviour might struggle to effectively fill. And let's say they don't manage it. Let's say that they can't find a way to effectively put Nemesis into the game because he's too big, because he's too tough, because he's too reliant on firepower and breaking through walls and other stuff that DBD can't have. Or because whatever power they come up with is effectively a rehash of other killers like the Deathslinger. Let's say they can't make a tyrant, so who do they pick instead? Well, the obvious answer, and I'm sure you could all see this coming by now, is Jack Baker. Think about it. Every problem that Nemesis, or any tyrant for that matter, might have in Dead by Daylight is solved by switching gears suddenly to Jack. All Nemesis does at melee range is punch you and throw you around a bit. Jack is exclusively a close range brawler. Whether he's using a shovel, or a paint roller, or even a pair of chainsaw shears, Jack is always getting up close and personal with you in a way that Nemesis never does. Nemesis being slowed down by pallets and flashlight doesn't make sense. That's not a problem for Jack. He's very tough, but he's still human size, and Ethan's attacks still stagger him. They just don't kill him for good. The struggle to fight back against Jack is what makes him so entertaining as a villain, because it isn't like Nemesis where he just sponges your bullets without even reacting. Jack feels it, but keeps going anyway because he knows it won't kill him for long. Hell, as part of Evelyn's hive mind, Jack Baker has partial control over the mold that infests his house and has taken over his body and his family. That gives him so much room to use it as part of his power. Maybe he can travel the map by crawling out of patches of mould that grow on the walls like the moulded do. Maybe after he kills a survivor they come back as a moulded under his control. Maybe he can use the mould to create temporary terrain to slow down the survivors. All of these things are perfectly reasonable ideas for a mould related power for Jack, and I'm sure I've only scratched the surface. But let's talk about the big reason that I think Jack can't be discounted as an option for the RE chapter. Money. Yes, Nemesis is still probably the most likely candidate, and yes, he would still make a ton of money, but in the realistic eventuality that behaviour is unable to make Nemesis work, Jack is still more than profitable enough to fill the role. When you hear invested RE fans talk about 7, they make it sound like it's some sort of spin-off, not real Resident Evil like 2 or 3 or 4, as if that's meant to write it off somehow. But it is worth remembering that Resident Evil 7 was, and still is, an incredibly successful game. As of March this year, RE7 has sold 9 million copies worldwide. That's more than the original Resident Evil 3 and the remake combined. According to Capcom's Platinum list, it's the second best-selling Capcom game of all time, behind only Monster Hunter World. And with the release of RE8 often being bundled with RE7 in a lot of places, that game is still doing numbers today. Regardless of how many die-hard RE fans might disavow it as not being real Resident Evil, Resi 7 was and continues to be ludicrously profitable. There is a very good reason that 2 of the 5 player characters in Capcom's new multiplayer title REverse are from Resident Evil 7, because that game is as much of a moneymaker as its predecessors, if not more so. Like it or not, Jack Baker is an icon of Resident Evil's new era of games, a new era that is becoming a financial powerhouse. Do I still think it's probably Nemesis? Yeah, I do. But if behaviour decides making Nemesis the killer won't work for the game's health, or if Capcom demands that they include a more recent character in a game that's still making money hand over fist, Jack is the undisputed best pick. Put it this way, there's probably a 75% chance that it's Nemesis, but if it isn't Nemesis for one reason or another, there is a 75 or more % chance that it's Jack. At this point, I'm more interested in the RE chapter to see whether they can even pull it off, than I am to see what it might bring to the game. I'm not excited for Nemesis per se, but I am excited to see if they can make him work. Making Nemesis function as a healthy and characterful part of DBD would be a hell of an achievement, and I always want to be wrong in my assessments about him before. I want Behaviour to be able to pull this off, because by getting interesting new licensed characters, nobody loses out. Would it make me like Nemesis as a character? I don't think so, but if they can make him work anyway, that would be a testament to how skilled Behaviour can be at making interesting new killers. Or, if they happen to also bring in my personal pick for the best killer in Resident Evil's history, then needless to say, I'd be pretty chuffed with that as well. But before I finish up, there's something I feel needs to be brought to your attention. According to Mazunda on the DBD Leaks Discord, there is no evidence of a Resident Evil map in the game files at the moment. That doesn't mean that we know there won't be a map, but all I'm saying is we haven't found one yet. And given the recent spate of map reworks, Resident Evil not getting a map at all is entirely possible. But if they're not going to give us a map, what else are they going to do to make the chapter special? 2 survivors is a very real possibility here, but let's consider something for a moment. Resident Evil is the first licensed franchise ever to have multiple realistic possibilities for a killer. Even Silent Hill was only ever going to have Pyramid Head. Adding something like the Missionary would have been nice for Silent Hill fans, but wouldn't have made any more money than Pyramid Head on his own. This is just me making the blindest of shots in the dark, but Resident Evil has got a problem where it will struggle to appease both the fans of the newer titles and fans of the older ones at the same time, due to the relative lack of overlap between its characters. This could be alleviated, to great profit to Behaviour and Capcom, with DBD's first multi-killer chapter. Yes, I know that would be a lot of work for Behaviour that they might not want to do, but we're not getting a map for the 5th anniversary for the first time ever. And this is the 5th anniversary with Resident Evil. They're going to want to do some impressive stuff. If we were ever going to get a multi-killer licensed chapter, this is going to be it. Giving us a full chapter of, say, Leon, Jill, Nemesis and Jack would satisfy everyone. It would satisfy hardcore fans of the older games, by ensuring Nemesis and the Twink are in it, while still tying it into Resident Evil games that are currently selling in big numbers, and reminding us that Resident Evil doesn't just have a historic past, but a bright, bright future. Now in all of this stuff, I could be right, I could be completely wrong. We'll just have to see. I won't be streaming the developer update myself, I'm be saving my reactions to that for a video, but I have a lot of friends, including the infamous RGB Thysox, who will be live streaming it on the day. And you'll probably find me in his chat. If you want to hear what I have to say as soon as the chapter is announced, by all means subscribe and you'll hear my update when it eventually happens. You can also follow my Twitter or join my Discord to catch updates in real time. And you can find those links in my description. You can even find my Patreon there if you want to support my content. I will never demand anyone to do that, but I will always be grateful. But thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you on the other side. Ta-ta for now.